3 violent criminals, a brutal prison, a daring plan to escape from Alcatraz by Deborah Hopkinson. At exactly 9:30 on the night of June 11, 1962, the lights at Alcatraz prison went out. Most of the inmates shivered on their thin, narrow beds as they tried to get some sleep. But not Frank Morris. Morris waited for the prison to quiet, his heart pounding. If all went according to plan, he would never sleep behind bars again. For months, Morris and 3 other prisoners, Alan West and brothers Clarence and John Anglin, had been secretly plotting to escape from the bleak prison, perched on an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. People said it was impossible to break free from the Rock, as Alcatraz was known. Morris and his friends were desperate to prove everyone wrong. They had developed an ingenious plan. For months, they had been using tiny tools to chip away at the concrete walls of their cells. Eventually, they made holes big enough to crawl through. Once they had a way out, they climbed up the ventilation shafts behind their cells and set up a secret workshop. Many had drowned. Men who had tried to escape before had drowned swimming in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. Morris and his friends did not intend to swim, though. Using stolen and handmade tools, they'd managed to make life preservers and a raft fashioned out of raincoats. Morris was certainly no stranger to escape. An armed robber, he had already escaped from several prisons. But Alcatraz was different. Security was tight. Guards counted the inmates many times each day and night. To fool them, Morris and his friends made dummy heads. On the night of their escape, they tucked the heads into their beds. In the dim light, the heads looked real. Now, as darkness settled over Alcatraz, everything was ready. Well, almost. At the last minute, Wes couldn't get out of his cell. Morris and the Anglin brothers went on without him. They wriggled out of their cells and climbed up plumbing pipes. Finally, they stepped onto the roof. Carefully avoiding the prison searchlight, they crawled silently across the roof and scrambled down a drain pipe. They were out. The salty breeze blew against their faces. Now all that stood between them and freedom was a 15-foot fence and the crashing, shark-infested waters of the bay. Men had made it this far before, only to drown or be turned back by the strong currents. One inmate had hidden in the sea caves, too scared to plunge into the water. He finally got so cold and hungry that he gave up and went back. Morris took a deep breath. Could they pull off the most daring escape in the history of Alcatraz? Island of the Pelicans. By the night of this great escape attempt in 1962, the small sandstone island of Alcatraz had been used as a prison off and on for more than 100 years. But its history goes even further back. Alcatraz was named Isla de los Alcatraces, Island of the Pelicans, in 1775 by Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala. After 1848, when news of gold in California spread, people worried that San Francisco might be attacked. Alcatraz, located a mile from shore, seemed the perfect place to build a fort. During the Civil War in the 1860s, the small 22-acre island was used as a military prison. Then, in 1934, the U.S. Department of Justice took it over. Alcatraz was about to become the toughest and most feared prison in America. Ready for troublemakers. During the 1930s, a crime wave hit the United States. Robberies and murders were on the rise. Some criminals had become incredibly powerful. They were as famous as movie stars. The public felt that a super prison was just what the country needed. Desolate and isolated, Alcatraz seemed like the ideal place to lock up these criminals. So officials set out to build the most escape-proof prison in the nation. Cell blocks built in 1909 were turned into a fortress meant to hold those who had tried, and sometimes managed, to break out of other prisons. Alcatraz opened as a federal prison in August 1934. Prisons across the country were notified that Alcatraz was ready to take troublemakers off their hands. As Alcatraz warden James A. Johnston later wrote, "They would select their worst. I would take them and do my best." At 5 a.m. on August 19, 1934, 53 prisoners boarded a train in Atlanta, Georgia, for the long ride to California. They were to be some of the first inmates at Alcatraz. Officials couldn't help feeling nervous. These men were going to Alcatraz because ordinary prisons couldn't handle them. Warden Johnston took every precaution. The prisoners rode in specially designed railroad cars with steel bars across the windows. No prisoner was allowed to leave his seat during any stop. The inmates arrived on August 22, 1934. By the end of the year, Alcatraz was housing more than 200 of America's worst criminals. A bitter surprise. A prisoner at Alcatraz found himself in a harsh, isolated world. Prisoners banged on bars. Foghorns blared in the distance. No newspapers were allowed. Inmates could listen only to certain radio programs, approved by the warden. A morning gong signaled wake up at 6:30 a.m. The men stood to be counted, then cleaned their cells. At the shriek of a whistle, they marched single file to breakfast, which lasted 25 minutes. After breakfast, utensils were counted. During the day, guards marched the inmates to jobs in the laundry, the garden, and the tailor shop. Head counts took place constantly. In the afternoon, inmates had supervised recreation time. Lights out was at 9:30 p.m., on the dot. Men who broke the rules faced harsh punishments. The most feared was solitary confinement. Prisoners hated to be cooped up in a tiny concrete cell, apart from everyone else, with only a hole in the floor for a toilet. In solitary confinement, a man was allowed a mattress at night, but even that was removed during the day. There was nothing to do but stare at the walls as time ticked by. The most notorious felons couldn't beat Alcatraz, not even gangsters like Al Scarface Capone. To many, Capone was a sign of the collapse of law and order in the 1920s. He was said to have murdered at least a dozen people. Capone was used to having power, and he was proud of his reputation as a big shot. He figured he'd be able to get special privileges at Alcatraz, just as he had in other prisons. As soon as he arrived, Capone met with Warden Johnston. "I have a lot of friends," he told the warden. "I expect to have a lot of visitors." Capone was in for a bitter surprise. He was allowed to see family, but not friends or fellow gangsters. Every prisoner at Alcatraz was treated the same, and there was nothing he could do about it. Eventually, Capone had to admit, "Alcatraz has got me licked." Daring escapes. By 1963, the island prison had become too expensive to keep open, and the government decided to shut it down. Today, Alcatraz is a landmark managed by the National Park Service. More than 1 million tourists visit every year. So do about 100 species of birds, including gulls, cormorants, and pelicans. So what about escapes? Alcatraz was a federal prison for 29 years. During that time, there were 14 escape attempts involving 36 men. 23 were caught, 7 were killed, and 1 drowned. 2 others tried to escape in December 1937. Officials believe they were swept out to sea. That leaves 3 men, Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin. After the night of June 11, 1962, they were never seen or heard from again. When the men were discovered missing, there was a massive search. According to some records, a raft was discovered on nearby Angel Island. There was also a report that a car was stolen that night, which could have been used by the escapees. But in the end, officials concluded that the men had drowned. Indeed, a body was found floating in the bay, but it was never identified. If the men had gone overboard, survival would have been unlikely. Hypothermia would have set in right away, and the powerful current would have easily dragged them to their deaths. People have debated their fate for decades. To this day, rumors still circulate that they are alive. There have been many sightings. Nothing has been proved. What do you think? Did Morris and the Anglin brothers make it? Or did they perish in the merciless waters of San Francisco Bay?